Well, it's nice to be here. I haven't been at ETHS since 1982 when my daughter graduated from here. At that time, we didn't have the kind of problems that we have now. I think of one sign of the troubles we have now is that Donald Trump, when he was campaigning last year for president, said, "Islam hates us." And he was asked at a subsequent TV interview, "That's pretty sweeping. Would you like to moderate that in any way?" And he said, "No, I stand by it. There's a whole lot of hate there." Well, if Islam hates us, that is scary. There are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, 23% of the population of the world, surpassed only by Christianity, which is 22%. Is 2 billion. And they are approaching each other to equity so that they will be about the same in 2050. And how does a quarter of the world fight the other quarter of the world, both of them together making up 50% of the world? Why was Donald Trump so certain that Islam hates us? Presumably because of 9/11. He equates Islam with terrorism, and he always said Islamist terrorism, as if they were spokespersons for the religion. Well, a number of polls have been taken. One of the most ambitious was the George Gallup poll of worldwide attitudes among the Muslims, and it found that they were asked, "Do you approve of the attacks on the Twin Towers and other places on 9/11? And 93% said no, they don't. 7% said yes. And then subsequent questions made clear that the large majority who disapproved were religious in their orientation, practicing and studying their heritage. And the 7% were non-practicing, not very knowledgeable about their religion. After all, the ones who carried out those terrible attacks were drinking the night before and having lap dances and expecting, so they claimed, 72 virgins in heaven, which no reputable Muslims believe. So what does he think Muslims believe? One creed that is dictated by Allah to Muhammad, he says, tell believers to pray in these words from Surah 2, Ayah 136. We believe in God and in what was sent down to us and what was sent down to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes, and what was given to Moses, Jesus, and the prophets by their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and we devote ourselves to Him. Now, as I came late to the Quran, the thing that impressed me most about it was its inclusiveness of people, not exclusiveness. Very narrow-minded Jews might think the chosen people are only the circumcised. Very narrow-minded Christians might think that the only chosen people are the baptized. But in the Quran, the chosen people are all believers in the one God. The only people who are outside are polytheists, whom he normally calls idolaters. Not infidels, as we would consider that today. Infidel to us might mean things like atheists and non-practicing religions other than polytheism, idolatry, and the Qur'an. But how can there be such an inclusive approach to belief in God? Well, all we have to do is look at the list of prophets of God, the people that Allah talked to and said, take my message. Beginning with Adam. You know, in Genesis, Adam sins, and the fall of man is supposedly traced there. And some people find there the doctrine of original sin, which we all suffer from. But in the Quran, Adam again sins, but he asks for mercy, and Allah is merciful toward him and makes him the first prophet, the first contractor into a covenant. And from then on, God sends messengers all the time, continual stream of messengers. He says, I approach the people that I created as my own, that I love and protect, and I've given different covenants to them. As Yahweh, I gave what is we call today the Old Testament covenant, and I spoke in Hebrew. And as the father of Jesus, I gave another covenant and gave it in Greek. And then I gave a covenant to you, Muhammad, and your followers in Arabic. But there's only one God. I was doing it all those times in all those languages in all those places. That's a pretty amazing approach to religion in general. So long as you believe in one God, you're part of one people. Now, I don't want to say that I agree with everything in the Quran or that others do. There are things that I don't agree with in Christian revelation, though I'm a Christian, and things that Jews that I know do not believe in, though they are Jews. There are some things that are troubling to us when we approach the Quran. For instance, slavery. Slavery is countenanced by all three religions. Believers in all three could hold slaves without being cast out of either the church or cast into hell. There were captured peoples that were enslaved under the Jewish and the Christian dispensations. And slavery was certainly countenanced by the Quran. The only difference that I could see is that the Quran makes an act of virtue loved by God, the freeing of slaves. Now, when Muhammad was preaching his revelations, there was not a government that would abolish slavery. You couldn't be anti-slavery in the sense that if the government doesn't enforce the anti-slavery position, then you cannot believe in the God, cannot follow the government or anything of that sort. But freeing a slave is loved by God in a way in the Quran that's not true of the Old Testament or the New Testament. You know, Paul says, Philemon has been my assistant, Philemon's slave has been my assistant, and it would be nice if you freed him, Philemon. He didn't say you have to, didn't say it's a great sin, you can't be a Christian if you don't free this one slave. But there's no such thing as this broad preaching of virtue as freeing slaves. In fact, for certain sins, the repentance is to fast and pray and free a slave. Now that's quite astonishing in terms of comparative cultures. Another thing that we have trouble with is misogyny. All three religions, in fact all cultures up to our own, have considered females to be inferior to males. But we have to approach the Qur'an as believing not in polygamy, but in polygyny. That is, multiple wives. Not a question of polyandry, multiple husbands. You never get people saying that. But you can have multiple wives in the Qur'an, as you could in the time of David and Solomon. They all had harems, and they were not considered to be untrue to the covenant of Yahweh. On the other hand, there were a lot of rules for multiple wives. You could only have a wife if you could support her in dignity. If you couldn't support her in dignity, you should not marry her. And you should not marry more than you can treat that way, and probably not more than 4. There are exceptions made. For instance, Muhammad could have more because he did things like marry the widows of his companions to give them a high position in their culture, and perhaps not to preempt the continuing marriage in heaven, because marriage continues in heaven, unlike in the New Testament, where Jesus said giving in marriage and being married will not occur in heaven. It certainly does in the Muhammad heaven. And as I looked into that more, not only ancient people but modern people in their original revelation, like others have had multiple wives. But the thing about marriage in the Quran is that the dowry system was very different from what we know in the Western culture. There, the dowry was given by the father of the bride to the bride's, of the groom, to the bride's father. It was family-to-family transference, and it was really a bond between the two, which you had to give money to assert. And so the way that you moved up in the culture of the West was that if you had enough for the dowry that you could get a husband from a really socially prominent family, that would advance your family. And therefore, people saved up to get a dowry that would bring them that kind of bond. And then, as time went on, they would have another daughter that they wanted to marry, and they'd probably have less to offer in a dowry, so they would go down in the social scale, and so on down 3 or 4, until you ran out of money, and then you would put the women in nunneries. Now, in the Quran, the dowry money is given directly to the bride. It's her property. And this was an amazing thing in the culture of that time, that the woman is a property owner, and it's hers. She keeps it, and you can't take it away from her. And if a man divorces the woman, she can take her dowry with her, which of course would be a great inhibitor of people wanting to divorce. And divorce is something that's very discouraged in the Quran. And even if it occurs, reuniting remarriage can occur. So even in a misogynist culture, which certainly the Old Testament and New Testament have, you have in the Qur'an, and yet it's tempered by this amazing ability of women to own their own property. Well, what about war? Another thing you always hear is that the Qur'an is a military revelation. And we often get, for instance, stray verses out of context that seem to say, lie in wait for your enemies and kill them. That's the so-called sword verse. The word sword doesn't occur there or anywhere else in the Quran. It does occur a lot in the New Testament and the Old Testament. But what is said is, after 4 months, lie in wait for the people you want to kill and kill them. Not kill non-combatants, not kill civilians, not kill children, but the enemies who had attacked you. And we look at that and it sounds pretty grisly, but what does the after 4 months mean? Well, in going back to Mecca, where the Kaaba, the great sacred place, was, even when it was profaned by idols, people still wanted to go there. It had been built before the polytheists, and it had been built by Abraham and his assistants, Abraham, the father of all the believers. So they would go back, and at a time when people were coming in caravans to Mecca, which was the great pilgrimage center, they would put up their gods in the Kaaba and worship them. And even when Muhammad had been sent out to Medina by people in Mecca, in order to come back when the Kaaba was still being used by the idolaters, they would have to strike up truces, like the peace of God in the Middle Ages, that in this holy area, we won't kill each other, no matter where we come from or what we believe. And in that truce, in various times, the Muslims were attacked by polytheists, by idolaters, and it was asked, can we fight them? And Allah, through Muhammad, says, no, you observe the truce, even if they don't. But when a truce is for 4 months, you observe it for 4 months. But then after, you can lie in wait for the people who had attacked you and fight back. The only just war in the Quran is a defensive war, responding to attacks upon you. And even then, if you are responding and the enemy accedes to your demands and begs for mercy, you must be merciful. The leading trait of Allah in the Quran, as far as I know, is mercy. There should always be a consideration of being merciful to everyone, even people who are your enemies. So that creed that I read, that God says, we believe in the revelation, your revelation that was sent to Abraham, Israel, Isaac, Jacob. Jesus is perhaps the most honored prophet until Muhammad. No other prophet has the preparation for his coming that he does. John the Baptist is a great prophet in the Quran because he is the forebearer of Jesus. And the mother of Jesus, Mary, is extremely honored. In fact, she's the only woman who has a name in the Quran. We don't have the story of Adam and Eve, we have Adam and his spouse. And Mary is as signally honored as she is in the New Testament. That is, she is born sinless, without any sin, and she bears Jesus as a virgin. So the Immaculate Conception and the virginal birth are in there just as they are in the New Testament. And even more interesting, all of the prophets come equally from God, but Jesus is the only prophet who predicts the coming of Muhammad. So there is a very close tie between the two. And to think that we attack the Quran because it opposes us, namely Christians, is really staggering in its misunderstanding. So, trying to understand a different culture, a different revelation, is something that is vital that we do when we have people telling us Islam hates us. We've got to go and get them. We've got to hate them back, beat them out, cut them off. That came home to me. After 9/11, I was sitting in a group of friends at Northwestern, academicians all, and we were wondering, how does 9/11 connect with Muslim beliefs, culture, etc.? And we tossed that around for a while until somebody said, well, how many of you have read the Quran? And none of us had. And one friend said to me, Garry, you spent a lot of time studying religion and you never read the Quran? And I was ashamed to say I had not. So I quickly went to work trying to read it and read about it and get some outsider's knowledge of it. One of the things I was going to call this book is A Catholic Looks at the Quran. And I say in the book that I hope other books will come out. A Protestant looks at the Quran, a Jew looks at the Quran, because we live in a world where we cannot afford to be so ignorant of each other as I was about the Quran. And as many of this is a great audience because I've never seen so many who had read the Quran. It's a pretty rare distinction. So my book is an attempt to say there's nothing we have to fear about the Quran. In fact, it's an inspiring document. God in the Quran is in constant communication with his creatures, not only the animate ones, but inanimate ones. We are told, Moses and the mountain both prophesied me. Birds prophesied me. Ants prophesied me. Prophesy is not predict, of course, it's proclaim the Lord. It's no wonder then that Pope Francis said in The Joy of the Gospel that the Quran is a spiritually enlightening document which can help us be devout to God as Christians, taking as example the devotion of Muslims. Now, that's something I treasure, and that helped me to write this book. Thank you.
Okay, well, good evening, folks. My name is Tahera Ahmad, and my bio is shared. I am the Associate Chaplain at Northwestern University and the Director of Interfaith Engagement. I also teach over at Garrett Theological Seminary. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be up here with you, Professor. I was just like, social media, you know, like it was all over. I was like, guess who I get to be on stage with? Really excited. I had the opportunity to read the unedited version twice, because the first time I read it, I was reading it from the perspective of, okay, this is cool, I'm gonna, be on stage with him, I need to know what's going on. And then the second reading was from the perspective of, I was trying to take my Muslim hat off and also think of what he was saying from a historic and theological perspective. And I think what really stood out to me as we begin this conversation is how timely this text is. Many of my non-Muslim friends who I come across, whether it's in interpersonal relationships or when I'm traveling and speaking, they want to read the Qur'an and they want to know more about the Qur'an, but there seems to be as some kind of fear or distancing. For one, some of them feel that this is an arduous task. Like the Qur'an is 6,235 or 36, depending on which interpretation you follow, verses. And as a a country that celebrates Judeo-Christian values, as our president also shares that, there's a question on how do you even approach the Qur'an. And so that fear of the unknown, in many cases, I think, distances folks from reading the Qur'an. So I was wondering, when you were asked this question, well, have you read the Qur'an? In your context, you're a theologian, you're a scholar, you're a historian. It was, by default, you should have been reading this. But for the average non-Muslim out there, and even many Muslims, in fact, I don't think have the opportunity to actually really dig into what does the Qur'an mean for them besides just the reading of it in prayer. So what would you recommend to folks who have this initial kind of reluctancy to approach something that may seem as an arduous task, or because they're not sure how to even approach it? It's something that is the unknown, and there's a lot of fear associated with, well, what if I read it wrong, and what if I'm not understanding of what is God actually saying in this?
Well, that's very true of the reaction that many people had when I told them they should read the Quran. Obviously, some won't, and some feel they can't. But if we have enough of us who have, and try to respond to these tremendous attacks on Muslims, not only by President Trump, but by people like Frank Gaffney and Pamela Geller and others who keep telling us this is a hateful place, a hateful document. If we have enough people who can say, no, it isn't. Think of this verse, think of that verse. That's one way to nibble at the edges of the problem. And people who might think not only is it hard to do, but it's superfluous, it's not really anything pressing. It is very pressing, because we do now have people who want to preach a holy war against the Quran. In fact, they will say, we're just responding to the fact that there's holy war recommended in the Quran. As far as I know, that's not true. There's not that concept of holy war is not there. As I say, when the defensive war is defended, and it's said the truth applies for you, but not for these people when they attack you, and you have to respond to them. The sword verse, so-called, arises because the fact that the truce was to guarantee a holy area of non-combat. Holy ground was at issue, and it's easy to shift that over to holy war. But that's not there at all. So we have to tell people we can't go attacking Muslims everywhere. If Islam hates us, what do we do about Khizr Khan's son, who died saving his fellow soldiers. What do we do about the many Muslims who are doctors, who are policemen? We have to ask ourselves over and over, can we really believe that all of these people in the world and in America, for instance, when Trump says, oh no, this is not a religious test that I'm going to keep Muslims out, it's only people that have a lot of Muslims, those countries that have a lot of Muslims. That's not any way to fight 23% of the population of the world. So now, whether you think it's hard or other, you should at least ask enough people who know something about the Quran, even a little bit, like me, is it true what Trump says, what Geller says, what Gaffney says? And it's easily disproved if you've read the Quran, and you can point people to particular passages, but we have to recruit each other into a war on ignorance. It's ignorance, of course, that stands in the way, as in so many matters. People should not have the right to say that the Quran is a hate document and get away with it. And we have to educate enough people to know enough about it to say, stop it. We've got, you know, it was tremendous ignorance that took us into Iraq. George Bush and Dick Cheney and their peers said, Saddam Hussein is a tyrant. He's oppressing the people. They don't want to be oppressed. All we have to do is knock him off, and the people will not be oppressed. They'll be so happy that we've done that. They'll welcome us as liberators, throw flowers at us. And they had no idea, though they had people trying to tell them, that the situation in Iraq was that a Sunni minority was used by a largely secular Saddam Hussein through the Ba'ath Party and the army to oppress a Shia majority. And so it's not simply a question of oppressed people loving freedom and are freeing them, but when we knocked off Saddam and dismantled the Ba'ath Party and dismantled the army, those were the people who had resources, knowledge, weapons, etc., to be quite resentful that they were being thrown out and to organize tremendous resistance, which has gone on for the longest war in our history. And it was all undertaken out of ignorance of Islam. That's a pretty striking lesson that should make us stop doing this. And the only way we can stop doing that is to realize there are conflicts in the Islamic world, as in our world, but we can't reduce it all to a simple, get rid of Saddam, get rid of the Ba'ath Party, get rid of the army, and then they will want a democracy exactly like ours, because George Bush said they envy us our freedom. And that will spread democracy throughout the Middle East. So it was easy for him to say in the early months, mission accomplished. We're getting out, we don't have to worry about that. All the people who were freed will love us. The lesson, I think, has to be, let's stop being ignorant.
I wanted to highlight one of the, what you pointed out about there are many Muslims in this country who are contributors to the great American social fabric. And stat that I wanted to throw out there, and folks are always really surprised when I share this, that Gallup reports that 1 in 10 physicians in the country, in the United States, is a Muslim. And so I often say that you're more likely to be saved at the hands of a Muslim than killed. And people laugh, and they're like, yeah, that's right, Dr. Patel, that's my doctor, or Dr. Ahmad. I wanted to actually really ask you, as you were reading the Qur'an, which means, that which is to be recited, at least the Arabic of it. As you are reading the Quran, you state in your book that there's like this desert culture which is haunted by this idea of water and beautiful rivers, and that heaven is this place of great water. And then you talk a little bit about just the beauty of the Quran, like the trees and the mountains, and the prophets kind of talking to the nature around them, and Abraham asking the question of where is God, and you compare that in parallel to the Old Testament. And I'm wondering, as you were reading the text, what was your favorite part? Like, was there a part where you were like, gosh, this is so beautiful, this really speaks to me?
Well, my favorite part is when Solomon is talking to the birds.
Oh, yes.
And he says, where's the hoopoe? And the hoopoe comes in late. And he says, why are you late? And the bird says, I was flying over the Queen of Sheba's realm, and I asked if she worshipped you, Allah, as we do, Solomon. And she said no, she had an idol. And so Solomon sends back a message, obviously an oral message. Writing was not available, and especially not to birds. And the bird goes and delivers the message, which is, come to me and I'll try to teach you to worship the one God. And that's a kind of a key to me to the fact that all creatures are in dialogue with the Creator. They talk to, and I think modern environmentalists should love the Quran, because there's this loving interaction between Creator and creation. And it can really be scary too, because when one sinner is being cast into hell, he says, I didn't commit that sin. And his skin says, yes, you did. I was there. And the sinner says, why are you talking? And the skin says, God teaches us all to talk to him and to testify to the truth. That's pretty amazing.
I was rereading those verses and reminded of how beautiful heaven is, and then Dante's Inferno, and I was like, oh gosh, that's in the Quran too.
Yeah, hell is more hellish in the Quran than anything.
Now you know why we're so devout.
But I wonder why it's so well populated, because God always offers people a second chance. Adam was a perfect example of that. You might sin, but if you repent and do penance and do things like fast and pray and free a slave, he'll be merciful. So the omnipresence of mercy seems to cut down the flow of traffic into hell.
There's this idea in the book that you share, which I found fascinating as a young scholar, an aspiring scholar. I'm still intrigued, and I'm wondering if there's more. Maybe I'll have coffee with you on this. This idea of abrogation, and whether the Quran or Islam as a religion is, the super successor of Christianity and Judaism. And you make the argument in the text that actually the Quran or God through the Quran is saying, the Jews, you follow whatever was given to you. The Christians, there's a text for you, or there's the gospel for you. The Torah is for the Jews, and you will be tested on your own paths. And that there is no abrogation per se of the entire religion super succeeding the other. I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because I think when we talk about the purpose of why we're here, of learning about inclusion and diversity and how we celebrate each other. And so if you could talk a little bit about that idea of how the Quran really values Jews for who they are and being able to practice their own religion, and Christians for who they are and being able to practice whatever it is that Jesus taught them.
Yeah, abrogation, is that nask? Is that the word?
Yes.
There's debate about what could be abrogated within the Quran, but some people say that because certain actions of Jews and Christians are attacked in the Quran, that God is abrogating the whole covenant with the Jews, the whole covenant with the Christians. But what he does is, for instance, when he went to Medina, there were many Jewish property owners around, and there was clashes, there was conflict, naturally. And there was criticism of the Jews by Allah through Muhammad. But the criticism really said, in effect, you're violating your own covenant. Everybody should stick to their own covenant. That was my agreement with you. I drew up the covenant for all of you. And you can say to the Jews, you're committing usury, which is forbidden in your own covenant. And as a matter of fact, he criticizes Muslims who are committing usury. Mecca was a big entrepot of various cultures and currencies, and very difficult to draw up contracts. If you're sending out a caravan and you have to say there's a risk factor that has to be involved in the contract, it's not simply the value of the thing in itself, but the danger of delivering it in another place. So there's an awful lot about commercial contracts in the Quran, and you can say that there are clashes with Jews who are not, but they're violating their own contract. And he says that about Christians in a far more important way than about Jews. He said the true revelation to Jesus was of the one God, his Father. And at a certain point, not really until the 4th century, the attempt was made to recognize the fact that Christians from the outset had prayed to the Spirit and to the Son and to the Father. And for Muhammad, that was tritheism, not monotheism. It was 3 gods. And so Allah says, I don't need helpers. You know, these superfluous people are helpers. So it's true that the Quran does not recognize Trinitarian Christianity. It thinks the only true Jesus revelation is Unitarian. So he would agree with Unitarians, but not with Trinitarians. But that doesn't mean you can hate them or attack them or anything of that sort. It's them lapsing from their own revelation, in his view. And that's too bad. You can preach that you should stop and go back to the original revelation to Jesus, but it's hardly a matter of setting up a holy war or any kind of disconnect between the original Christian revelation and the original Muslim.
So I have some tough questions too, but I don't know if I'm allowed to ask them. Is that okay? I mean,
It's more time, we're at 7:55, so maybe go for about 10, 15 more minutes. Does that sound good? And then we'll go to
I mean, do folks want to hear the tougher questions? Yeah, okay. They're, you know, I mean, they're not that tough. We've kind of chatted a little bit about them. So, you know, one of the things that you say towards, well, basically in chapter 12, you know, I was reading through it and I was like, this is so great, this is awesome. And then I get to chapter 12, and when it says, you know, Torah, Gospel, and Qur'an are all patriarchal and therefore misogynist. I had to take a pause there, and I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be interesting. And then you say, well, in all 3 of them, there are traces of dignity and worth intended by the Creator when He made women. The task for feminists is to identify, investigate, and develop these traces. So as a Muslim feminist, in my own journey with the Qur'an, I will acknowledge it's been one that has not been easy. It's been something that I've struggled with. And even as my role as a female chaplain, there are like 5 or 6 of us in the entire country, believe it or not. The idea of even, for example, reciting Qur'an out loud, which I will share with you hopefully at the end of this program, is not very common in many parts of at least the American Muslim community. It is actually more practiced in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, parts of Egypt. And I'm wondering if, are the verses that you're looking at when it comes to the way in which Qur'an is speaking about women, my reading of it has been that it was challenging patriarchy. In fact, the 7th chapter to be revealed chronologically, which is actually towards the end of the Qur'an, because Professor mentions in his text that the Qur'an in its compilation, the way it is compiled today is not in the actual revelation order. So revelation order, actually you would have to look up the actual chapter to say, from the 23 years that the Qur'an was revealed in, during the time of the Prophet, where is this chapter, where are these verses revealed? That's actually something you would have to investigate. You would not know that by just picking up the Qur'an. So the 7th chapter to be revealed challenges, female infanticide, for example, that it says, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, that this female infant that you are bearing, it will ask you on this day of judgment, which you mentioned in your text that the pre-Islamic Arabs did not believe in this afterlife, a concept. But that, if they think they're so high and mighty and they're getting away with killing young, fetus, that they're not going to get away with it, right? This whole idea of dowry being given to a woman, the idea of... So in some sense, Muslim feminists argue that actually the Qur'an, for its time and space, like in 7th century Arabia, it gave women probably many more rights than they actually had. The question today is, how do we look at those verses in its own context? So you cite the verses about inheritance, which there's a wide range of scholarship within the Muslim world on, do you only follow the word of the text in that particular way, or are you able to look at what was the actual context, just in the way you do with the holy war concept? Because there are people who will take those verses and misuse them, absolutely. In that similar way, do you think that your reading of how women are presented in the Qur'an has been just? It's a fair question for me to ask you, because when I read that, one of the things I think about is, are these verses being read in its own context? And then the second point I also want to make very quickly, because of the sake of time, is the Qur'an doesn't mention names of women, even for the case that we just talked about, the Hopi bird, the hudhud with Solomon. The Qur'an doesn't mention the name of the Queen of Sheba. It will always, the only person or the only woman mentioned is Mary, and I think it has a lot to do with the role of Jesus. But all the other women, the wife of Pharaoh, who the Qur'an says is someone who will receive heaven and glorifies her, the women are mentioned, but always by wamra'at, like the woman of, or someone who was not named. And some Muslim scholars say the reason for that is not because the Qur'an degraded women, but rather it was part of the culture. It was revealing the name of a woman it was almost like revealing her, like herself. It was like you protected the chastity of a woman by protecting the chastity of her name. And I'm wondering if that has come across in your kind of overall outlook in how you've been reading this.
Well, I think you're quite right that Muslim feminists fight misogynist interpretations, and there are a lot of them. I've read 6 or so and cite them in the text. But they have to fight a culture that, frankly, I believe, I may be wrong, but I think all of ancient and medieval cultures were misogynist. And fighting that is just the same for Jewish women and Christian women. They have to deal with the fact that the culture around the revelations, whichever revelation, said in law and other ways that women could do only so much and inherit so much and own so much. I must say that my own Christian tradition is as bad as can be. You know, Thomas Aquinas is a very great theologian of the Middle Ages, and he was enlightened in many ways because he was a great student of Aristotle. Aristotle said that women are accidents, that if procreation took place as it should, with fiery seeds inseminating the woman, only men would be born. And it's only when less fiery seeds are inserted in the woman that you get a woman. Now, Thomas Aquinas quoted that and agreed with that and said, and then used biblical arguments. It said, for instance, Genesis says that it was not good for man to be alone, therefore God created Eve, named in the Old Testament but not in the Qur'an. And Aquinas says, if it were just a matter of giving him companionship, he should have given him another man, because another man would be an intellectual equal who could carry on much more companionably with man than a woman. Why did he create woman? Because there would be no successors. You have to have women to bear children. So it's the job of women to bear children and nothing else. Now that's something that Thomists hate, the fact that their great hero taught the worst of antiquity and biblical tradition. So the idea of a revelation doesn't necessarily mean, in a fundamentalist sense, that every word is precisely exactly what it seems to mean, because God is speaking in the context and the culture and the language of the people receiving the revelation. So the defect is not in the revealer, but in the people that he's revealing to. You can only say so much to people who don't know enough to grasp the whole of what God knows, what angels know, what jinn maybe know in the Muslim cultures. So I think you're right that you can fight that. I called my chapter on that, Fighting Back. But there's no one to fight if there's not a patriarchal culture.
Okay, so my last question for you, and then we'll open it up. You know, a lot of my non-Muslim friends and just folks that I meet always ask me this question. They say, look, it seems like you're saying that the Qur'an itself is a good book, it's a good text, but you know, the Christians and the Jews, we've gone through like reformations and we've gone through this idea of reinterpretation, and like we know all the stuff that's in there that's kind of like Leviticus, we kind of, you know, put to the side, and we were able to like work through that. It seems like the Muslim world or the Muslim people, you're just not able to get with the modernity or the reinterpretation. And so what would be your answer to that?
I don't quite understand the question,
So,
precisely.
Folks often, the critique that I hear from my non-Muslim colleagues and friends is that Islam has this inherent inability to change with or to adapt to postmodernism, or just, you know, the idea of, you know, Christianity going through like this idea of reformation, or that most Christians will look at some texts or controversial text or problematic text and say, oh, we know that's there, but no one really practices that today. Whereas with Muslims and the Quran, it seems like we're just not able to get with the program, so to speak.
Well, there are a lot of people who are fundamentalists in Christian culture and in Jewish culture who don't allow any interpretation of the revealed word. Look at Israel, where the strict adherents to Torah say that they have to be exempt from the draft, for instance, or have to set very high standards for people to be admitted into Israel. Those kind of fights against each other and against modernity are very common. My own Christian tradition, the papacy, fought the Enlightenment tooth and nail, and it goes down to our time. They fought Galileo, they fought Darwin, they fought all kinds of moves into modernity. One of the things we have to cope with in studying any religion is that they're very easily perverted. Christians end up waging crusades. The reason for that, I think, is that a certain tribalism within the religion can be exploited. And once you set up that you are the spokesman for God, that God speaks on your side, God wills it, that means your enemy is the enemy of God. And it's very easy to slip into the idea that the enemy is the devil. So the worst wars are religious wars, in which you have to fight to protect God against these evil people. Lucretius in the Latin world said, tantum religio produit suadere malorum. That is, how suasive is religion to our bane. Religion is a dangerous thing. And of course, therefore, my atheist friends say, well, just get rid of it. But we have a lot of dangerous things we don't want to get rid of. Sex is dangerous. Families are dangerous. Marriage is dangerous. But we don't want to get rid of them, but we want to control the danger. And I think that's the attitude we should have to religion. We know it's not only a sweet blessing that makes everybody love everybody, but it's a leashed tiger, and we've got to make sure that leash holds.